All right, here we are. Welcome. Hello to everybody who is tuning in for our live kitchen table conversation. Hello and welcome. We're very excited to be back with you all. And this is actually our 46th live kitchen table conversation already. I don't know where the time has gone, but I know I have deeply enjoyed being in these conversations with each of you. And today we are very excited to be welcoming in a special guest star today, Steve Henn, and we will have you introduce yourself in a minute here. But just as a reminder for folks who are tuning in, who maybe haven't seen our conversations before, just as a reminder, the Men and Masculine Folks Network has been putting on these live kitchen table conversations ever since the pandemic kind of started. We shifted to this virtual platform, and our goal really is to have conversations with men and masculine folks throughout our communities who are really all about shaping new meanings of masculinity and thinking about imagining what that might be, what that might look like for us to show up in new, authentic ways, in caring and thoughtful ways in our communities as men and masculine folks. So that's a little bit about why we're here and why we're holding these conversations. And again, my name is Sean Hayes. He, him, his are my pronouns. And maybe we could start off with Felix and Pheng introducing yourselves, and then we can hand it over to Steve to kind of tell us a little bit more about yourself and your story.
Hello, everyone. My name is Felix Martinez. My pronouns are he, him, and his, or él, and I work for Esperanza United as an engaging men and boys program specialist. Super happy to be here in the conversation.
Yes, good to be here today, paying he, him, his. And I'm excited for this conversation with Steve on his work.
Okay, and I'm Steve Henn. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm here, I think, mostly in my capacity as a poet. I'm a poet and a high school English teacher and a dad, and I wrote this book, American Male, which is a chapbook of poems that deal with masculinity, I suppose, in ways that we don't often think of masculinity. So deal with some of the poems talk about experienced in various emotional states or experiences that are not what are typically accepted as masculine, right? So that's kind of what I'm here for, is to share some of the poems and talk about them, I think.
Yeah, that sounds awesome. And I know, just to give a little background, Steve, you and I met, I think we said back in April. I got invited by a friend of my wife, Amy, to a poetry workshop that you were putting on. And I can't remember exactly what it was called, but I know that it had something to do with masculinity and how we can utilize poetry to sort of take a deeper look at our own masculinity, at the patterns and the habits and the things that we see, how those show up in our lives. And I remember I was pretty terrified to join that workshop because I do not identify as a poet. I have not written a lot of poetry myself, but I thought, you know what, I'm going to do it. I'm going to go for it. I'm going to give it a try. And I remember the experience being really, really cool. And I know, for me, as someone who doesn't necessarily think or do those sorts of artsy, that side of things, it was really cool to get my brain into a new way, kind of looking at that piece of masculinity through that new lens. And so that's a little bit about how you and I got connected, Steve. And then I think after the fact, I was like, this would be really interesting to have you come on and talk a little bit about, like, how did you start doing this work around masculinity? What is it about that kind of stood out for you? And yeah, I know we'd love to hear more about that story and how you came to be here.
All right. The workshop was called Alternative Masculinities. And I basically took some of the poems from the book I wrote and used them as model text a little bit, and not necessarily models real stylistically, but models thematically. And so I took poems about being gentle, or poems about being embarrassed or ashamed, or poems about all these emotions that men don't often express or don't often acknowledge very publicly, and basically shared my work and said, now you try one with a similar kind of theme or with a similar kind of experience. And so that was really an experiment. That workshop was the first time I gave it, and I do think it went pretty well. I was happy with what I heard from the participants. It was a lot of fun. I started writing poems about masculinity. This book was published in March or so of 2022, and I was writing a lot of the poems in the previous year, a couple of years or so. And I don't know, there wasn't a deliberate choice to write about masculinity, but it was something that I kept returning to because I knew I've had this feeling as a poet and as a man, as a person, that I have all these emotional experiences and all these kind of things that are not, I guess they're not certified by what it means to be a man, or they're not the type of thing that the men I grew up with, or the men who were my coaches or my teachers or whatever, were really encouraging. And so I wanted to work through and think through, in some cases, a lot of memories about this or that experience and what masculinity had to do with it, and how I feel. And I've always felt a little bit different as a masculine identifying person. I do definitely identify as a masculine person, but I have boys are supposed to be, well, we get taught to be aggressive in sports. We get taught to be really assertive, and we get taught to sort of take the lead and that kind of thing. And that wasn't something that always resonated with me. Sometimes I was a quieter kid and that kind of thing. So that's where the poems came out of, is thinking through some of those experiences of growing up and so on.
And I appreciate that, Steve, and again, welcome. I think it's really a platform, right? To what you're sharing there, is that it's a platform or a medium through which to express and to be able to come to who we are, or to understand our own identity, especially as men and masculine identified people, and to be able to actually work through and navigate some of our own emotions that we perhaps may not have good understanding about, or a good grasp about, because society hasn't taught us, or our families haven't taught us in that. And so I appreciate hearing that, because I think that for those who hear these conversations, it's not always necessary that men would want to come into conversation the way that we are, right? Or the way that we do constantly here at the kitchen table in our series here. But there's other ways in which our expressions of masculinity and our emotions can actually happen in a way that isn't going to be harmful to others, right? So what is the medium? And I think that's what I'm hearing from what you're sharing, is what is the medium that we are going to use, right? As masculine identified people, to actually understand who we are, to be able to actually go back to our own childhood memories of what may have been missed, or may have been lacking, or was not there for us, right? And I think that it also speaks to me on a more personal level. I think poetry really speaks to our own sort of like desires and needs, and it also fulfills some part of who we are and what I am, and allows for me to also truly share things that I may be ashamed to share, or may not want to actually fully share, or may not know how to share as well too, right? And so I appreciate hearing that part of it.
Yeah, growing up, I started writing poetry regularly when I was about 15 or so, as a freshman in high school. And a poet is not something a boy is really supposed to be. So that's an experience that I had as a young man. People kind of look at you a little weird if you're a 15-year-old kid who writes poetry. And thankfully, I had a little bit of support, from my mom at the time, and from teachers. I had a really good teacher in high school who was a good model. Jack Musgrave, and they encouraged that kind of expression. But nobody. It wasn't that the coach types, were like would criticize it or anything. It's just that there weren't a lot of models for sensitivity and thoughtfulness and that kind of thing, and so I had to kind of go that way. And actually, what happened a lot, what still happens to some degree, is I had to deal with things like anger and having a temper and that kind of thing, because that's just a very male experience, is not being able to negotiate your anger. And my dad was out of the house a lot when I was in middle school. He was off and hospitalized for depression and anxiety issues. And before that, he would just kind of have a hair trigger when it came to the temper. And so he could blow up, not all the time, but it's just occasionally he'd blow up for some reason. And that was kind of the model I had when I was a elementary school age kid. And then he died at the end of my freshman year of high school, just after he'd come back home for a few months and gotten on a antidepressant medication that was working for him and so on. And so I kind of lost that relationship all through my high school years too.
Thank you for sharing that, Steve. I have a question. Obviously, while you're writing these poems, I assume that it make you question and rethink your masculinity through the poems. And do you have any challenges going through that, through writing the book, questioning yourself, your behaviors? You talk about anger. Can you talk a little bit to us about that?
Yeah, I noticed as I was starting to get these poems down a couple years ago, I was drawn to write about experiences that I'd had inside that I hadn't talked about very much. And there's a variety of experiences. One was being a middle school kid, and the boys would do. So there was a janitor named Bob, right? Bob the janitor, and kids would make fun of him he'd pick up change off the floor, and boys would put like a quarter on a string with a piece of glue and like put it on the floor and then yank it away when Bob went and reached for it. And that was something that I thought was a toxic kind of masculine behavior. It was something that the boys always did, the girls didn't do it. And so those kinds of experiences where there's kind of this social expectation to be to behave that way. And other things are like there was when I was a freshman in high school, we had diving day in PE class, and I screwed it up completely. I dove and I landed on my belly, and I smacked the water real hard, and I came up and I cried. And so there's a handful of experiences with public crying in the book that I had, because I had that happened a few times, and there's maybe 2 or 3 poems that deal with that in the book, different experiences, and that's something that's very taboo. Adult men think you've got kind of an issue if you're a boy who cries in public, even if something has happened that's legitimately worth crying about. So yeah.
I was going to say, I mean, also, I think men and masculine folks as adults too. I mean, that is pretty rare that I have seen, men in my life cry and just openly, share and express emotion like that. Other than the anger, like that is what I remember seeing a lot, like from my dad, and just like the other men in my life. It was like anger was an emotion that they were willing to share, or I don't know if it was like a conscious choice. I mean, I know for me, when my anger flares up, it's definitely not always conscious, or at least I'm not conscious of that all the time. Most of the time I'm not. But I think it makes me think of something a teacher of mine, Norma, talks about how Kleenex is for snot, and we should like let those tears and that water come out and be proud of that. That's like a part of us as humans, that all of us experience that sadness or crying. I mean, we all do that, but then do we actually let folks know when we're feeling those things? I'd say most of the men and masculine folks in my life, I think that is something that we're trying to practice, is Like, actually, yep, we're really good at expressing anger, not always in healthy ways, but like actually what is underneath that anger? It seems like that's always sort of like the go-to emotion that men and masculine folks express. But, you know, in my own personal experience, every time I have like an explosive anger reaction, it's usually because I'm feeling hurt. It's usually because I'm feeling like someone didn't listen to me or care about what I had to say or what I was feeling. And, yeah, and I was also going to just bring in like one of the, I can't remember exactly what one of the prompts was, but I remember during the workshop, you know, thinking back to, I had written a poem, you know, during one of the prompts that you had shared, that it was like about middle school or like a time when you felt fear or, you know, something like that. I can't remember the exact prompt. But even like thinking about that, like men and masculine folks don't often talk about our own fears and the things that scare us too. And I remember sharing and writing this poem about an experience I had as a younger, I must have been in maybe 5th or 6th grade, and being at a sleepover party where everybody wanted to watch this scary movie. And I do not like scary movies, even to this day. It's probably because of this experience.
Same.
But yeah, I remember writing this poem and, you know, like really kind of going back in that memory of mine and like feeling that fear that you know, I was afraid. I didn't want to watch this scary. It was like Scream 2 or something, you know, back in the 90s. And I remember everybody voted to watch it. And so, of course, we're all sort of laid out on the living room floor of whoever's house we were at in sleeping bags. And they turned this movie on. And I made it through about the first scene where someone gets, you know, brutally killed in those movies. And I just, you know, I remember just going under my sleeping bag and trying to, you know, get out of there mentally and not have to focus on that. But I didn't feel that safety to say, actually, can we switch it? Like, I'm scared of this. I don't want to watch this. So it's really interesting, the things that, you know, how much of what we actually feel is like, we don't actually share a lot of that, I think, as men and masculine folks.
Yeah, one of the experiences I had, I got sober about 5.5 years ago. I'm a recovering alcoholic. And one of the experiences I had at poetry readings that I was doing in the couple of years past that is every time I did a reading, I would cry. Some poem would make me cry, or a couple of poems would make me cry. And so I'd have that public display of, you know, what some people consider not an appropriate emotion for men. And I had to kind of get used to that. And after a while, I just let it happen. You know, if you're going to emote and feel that way, there's nothing wrong with it. And people actually in poetry reading audiences are I guess more they're not gonna boo you for crying or anything. And then that poem you talked about, the one about fear, I used as a model a poem called "How in God's Holy Name Is This Boy Ever Going to Survive?" And that title is an imagined thing that my dad was thinking at one point. And the poem is about I had a really bad day that involved a lot of fear one particular day, when a friend and I walked from our neighborhood over to the boys' club and back, and all these things happened that really screwed with me and made me afraid. And I came back home, and my dad was angry because he felt like more should have happened. If I was going to be afraid, that there should have been more to it. Yeah, so that was I think the model. That was probably the model poem we used to talk about fear with American Male.
And I know there's a question in the chat as well in terms of how do we encourage young folks and young men, right, to really be able to express their feelings in a way that doesn't invalidate their anger, but also recognizes and does the harm that it could potentially come from that, or doesn't excuse the violence that is being used. And I wondered about that in relationship to it's a two-part question. It might be far stretch. I mean, it doesn't have to be for you, Steve, solely only, but for all of us to think about is like, how through this medium of poetry writing, how has that allowed for you to not only express and understand who you are, but allowed you to have a relationship with masculinity and manhood in a way where you are able to actually embrace the parts of you that desire to be masculine and desire to be a man. You know, because I think that in some ways for myself, and even asking that question for myself, it was for a long time, like in my community, it was always that if you only had yourself, or if I was the only son in my family for a very long time there, it was people in my extended family would be saying, hey, if when you get older, you're not going to be able to count on anybody, right? Because you have all these sisters, quote unquote, and you have no blood brother with you. And so you're going to be alone and you're going to be by yourself. So you need to actually build and help others out. But it doesn't go anywhere. And it was like, it hinged me on that was the idea of what it meant to be a man, was to have brothers, right, that were blood. And so for me, in expressing and finding who I am, it was through relationships that I had with other men folks that allowed for me to really understand that to be a man wasn't necessarily about blood relationship, that it was, and to build brotherhood wasn't just about that it could be through other ways, right? That we could build brotherhood through other ways as well too. So I wonder about aspects of that for any of us on this call. And I don't know if I'm articulating it the best that I am in my thinking, but like through the venue or through this medium, for example, poetry, how have we come to understand the maleness, quote unquote, in us, and be able to embrace the parts that perhaps society or community would say is toxic, you know, and to be able to be in relationship with it in a way that allows us to actually understand that relationship, right? Even if it's toxic, right? To the question around anger, right? And I know, and I've met a lot of men who've come to the place where they're like, just don't want to talk about anger, or they think that it's so bad. But it's, you know, but it's actually not. It's actually like we have to come to be in relationship with anger in a way where I am now in relationship with anger in a very loving way now, right? I give it permission when it shows up and knocks on my door. I tell it when it comes. Whereas in the past, to Sean's point, it had a key to my house. When it wanted to walk in, it walked in. When it wanted to disrupt and destroy me, it could do that because there was no boundaries there in any way, right? And so now I think that the relationship is much more loving than the relationship in the past, where it was like I had no boundary with anger, and anger had no boundary with me, you know.
I know I can kind of relate to what you're saying too, Peng, just in terms of in the last couple of years, like trying to actually redefine anger in a way where it isn't actually a negative emotion, where it isn't actually like, it doesn't actually have to be enacted in harmful ways, you know? And I think, you know, the example I can give for myself is, you know, when I became a parent, I've shared this, I think, on here before. I have like never experienced rage in the way that I have experienced it as a dad. And I remember the very first time feeling that rage that sort of built up and exploded. My daughter must have been maybe 3 or 4 months old, and it was one of the first times that Amy, my wife, had left. I think she had gone to the store or something. And I was at home with Eleanor, baby Eleanor, and she screamed the entire time that Amy was gone. And I remember just feeling that anger in my body, you know, like this really intense, heavy energy. And at that point, it was explosive for me, you know, like luckily I had walked away from the baby, but it was like, it came out, it exploded out of me, and I ended up punching this wall in our house. Luckily not too hard. I didn't injure myself, but it was really scary. for me after that happened, because I didn't know that I was capable of feeling all of that anger. And then after I sort of expressed it in that way, that sort of violent way, it was like, oh crap, I don't want to be angry. I try really hard not to be angry, and yet that's not realistic, especially, in the world that we're living in now, where there's just constant oppression and there's constant violence happening against people in our communities. And so it really has been a new learning, I think, on my part around not feeling guilty, not feeling shame when I feel anger about different things. But to your point, Pheng, it's like, what does it actually look like for me to express that in a healthy way, where I am more in control of that within, and not like just giving it the key to my house to be punching walls and things like that. So I guess I just appreciate the question, because I think there's, some of these emotions we just automatically say are bad and we shouldn't feel those things. And yet then when we do, it's like, I know for me, it's like shame, it's guilt, that stuff that comes up, rather than that gentleness that you're referring to, Pheng, that like understanding of, I have anger and that's okay. And now how do I actually express that? How do I actually be vulnerable and share that with the people closest to me in my life, so that they can sort of help me navigate, and we can teach each other and grow together, if that makes any sense.
There's a phrase I've heard in the recovery community that I think of a lot when you're having a hard time, or when you're getting real angry, or when you're having some emotional conflict within. The phrase is "be gentle with yourself," and I really like that. That's something that I've learned to adapt to over the course of 5.5 years sober, and getting beyond using alcohol as a kind of crutch for my emotions and so on. So be gentle with yourself is really something. What that means is just don't beat yourself up, and you don't need to beat yourself up more than necessary when you have anger or any other emotion that needs to come out. Just let it come out. Just don't do anything harmful as it comes out, I guess, to other people, right?
Absolutely, I agree with everything you guys have shared. But I have a question for you, Steve. In this book, do you have any favorite poems that you can give us a sneak peek? I personally haven't got the book yet. I'm looking forward now. The more I hear, I think the more excited I get. I think that this book will give us a story also about your life too, and as a man, and and that process from being a child to being an adult. So it's very exciting. Because you have a lot to give us, and stories are obviously meaningful. So can you give us a little sneak peek, so hopefully we can inspire some of the people that are listening to this live right now to hopefully get the book too?
Yeah, that'd be great. I'd like to read a poem in here called "Are You Picking Up What I'm Putting Down?" And it's about I was dating a woman who I assumed she was going to start lifting weights, and it's about how I negotiated that. So it's called "Are You Picking Up What I'm Putting Down?" Here it goes. My girlfriend tells me her new friend likes to lift. I say I prefer to put down. Not to criticize your fitness by disparaging it, but to never actually pick anything up. For a solid 10 seconds, I catch myself worrying. When she inevitably starts lifting, my girlfriend will get both bulkier and more cardiovascularly refined than me. Then I feel bad about critiquing anything about my girlfriend's body, even if hypothetical. Then I feel bad about feeling bad, and I try not to text her about any of this, because isn't it just like a man to require reassurance when pretty much the only problem is he's being an idiot? I am how I am, which is soft, like men often expect women to be. I couldn't not cry at my last 4 poetry readings. When I'm sober, I can't help listening to myself, and it hurts. My most indelible memories are not of courage, but terror. Every night until he turned 11, my youngest son accepted a kiss on the forehead and a tuck in, responding with, "I love you, Dad, you're the best dad in the world." To which I would say, "You're the best kid, buddy." And we would do that back and forth a few times, like an early caveman and his offspring, back before toxic masculinity became endemic to the species. So that's one that I like. Would you like to hear more? Or does anybody have any comments on that one?
No, I really like it. I really like it. It made me think about myself as a father. Of course, that journey of fatherhood, from early stages. My daughters now are, 18 and 20. So it made me think that it haven't been easy. I haven't been the perfect father, but I have given the best of me, and I have the honor that I can say that my daughters, they're both smart. They have been making great decisions, and it made me think, through my stages in life, how helpful it will be for me even to write, create poems or write them down, maybe have a journal, maybe something that probably for me, I was considered maybe not very masculine, considering the stereotypes and gender roles that I grow up with, but being loving, the importance of being loving, of caring for each other. It's a learning that I have with me, and I'm now that I have all this knowledge, I can wait hopefully to be a grandpa and be able to teach those to my grandkids or my nephews, when they're close by me. But I see very healing to write things down, so we can sometimes even go back and see, even when there are mistakes, hopefully it's going to help us to don't commit them again. But yeah, that's pretty awesome. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, just the mention of like thinking back, and I think you used the word hurt. Like, there's a lot of hurt that you feel when you think back, and I think I also can relate to that, and I feel like today it's like men and masculine folks, we're sort of told to like not feel those things, to sort of like forget about the past, leave the past behind, some of those things. And I think, for me, if I leave all of that hurt back there, like it's not gone, it's still in me, right? It's like, but we don't ever actually take the time to like feel into that, to take the time to think back to like those specific memories where it's like there was a hurtful thing that happened. And I think, and obviously it's not for everybody, right? Like not everybody is going to want to sit down and write poetry about their feelings, and about their memories and experiences. And yet, for me, I think it's like such a cool opportunity for healing. It's like this new way, for me. And I remember, I think there were 3 poems we wrote that day. And I felt really proud of what I created. After all of that, like sort of, I let that anxiety go and the fear of like, I'm not a poet. I'm not going to be able to create anything. And sure enough, I did create, 3 different poems, and I remember feeling really proud about them. And I wanted to share them with my wife, Amy. And I think she was like a little bit shocked. She was like, "You wrote poems, and you want to read them to me?" And I sort of prefaced it, and I was like, "This is, I mean, it's pretty raw stuff that I'm sharing about." And I remember I read through each one with her, and kind of in between each one, we sort of would talk about it a little bit. And I remember how vulnerable it felt, and it was like that fear. I can like remember sitting, in the chairs that we were sitting in, and it was like, palpable. Like it was really scary, even like with my person, to share these memories and this thing that I created. And after we had this whole conversation, I remember Amy coming to me and being like, that was really, really powerful. And it helped with our intimacy together, like the connection that we were able to have in that conversation. It just really helped, I think, grow our relationship in a beautiful way, because I was willing to like do that personal work. Like, it's like I was doing that for myself, and then, reaching out for connection to my partner. to be able to share those insecurities, those vulnerabilities. And then for her to be like, thank you, like that actually was really beautiful. That helps me have like a deeper sense of connection with you, because I shared those poems. And it was a really surprising and beautiful, joyful thing that we got to have after that.
Yeah, I retweeted something recently from a poet who said, poets are like, let me tell you about this thing that I don't tell anybody about. You know, that's kind of like a paradigm for poetry. And I think that can happen if you write about your experience with gender or masculinity or just memories, you know. And it definitely, for me, the writing process is useful for my own personal and spiritual growth, independent of anything I do with books or with readings or with trying to like build myself as a brand or as a name poet or something like that. The process itself is just useful to get down my thinking and to see what I think and to see what I'm feeling, I guess.
Yeah, I definitely see that. And I think that it could also be a way to sort of make yourself a third party and be able to actually see yourself from a different place as well too, rather than saying, oh crap, all of that is my crap, right? Whereas if you speak it, then it's like, oh, you know, those things are my things, that I actually have to own it and hear it. But I think that through that medium, you're, to your point there, Steve, for me at least, when I was doing some of the poetry years ago, was that it was a mirror, and it allowed for me to actually like sort of do this out of body experience, to be writing it. So it didn't seem and it didn't feel as shameful, or it didn't feel as like gut wrenching as it could be, and that I was able to actually freely be able to actually say and what it is that I actually want to say because of that, because of it being done in that way. And so I think that, you know, in going back to what I said earlier, is like, what is it that we as men and masculine folks could use, right, as the medium for us to actually understand who it is we are, to understand the relationship to who we are in a much more deeper way. And we have to be able to have some ability to find that medium, you know, to be able to understand and explore our identity of being male and our identity of being masculine and our expression of who we are, and our experiences around that, right? And the kinds of experiences that we want as well too, because I'm pretty sure that what all of us have shared here is that we think about our experiences and us having not any control over those experiences. But I do think that there is a desire to Steve's reading just now. There's a desire to say that, and an ability for us to be able to say, what are the kinds of experiences that I want, right? So instead of me picking things up, why don't I put things down metaphorically and leave it, rather than just taking whatever comes my way and say, I don't want any of those things, right? Or I don't want any of those feelings, for example, and I'm going to throw it off to other people. Instead, pick it up and give it off to other people, and I could care less what happens to other people in terms of the impact, right? But be able to actually like say, I'm going to set it down and actually take time to actually look at it, right? So I think that metaphorically that was what it was saying to me. And I would also really encourage folks who are listening to the conversation to find spaces and places or things that allows you to do it that way. I understand that not every person wants to come into a group, quote unquote, or to come to the kitchen table the way that we've been coming as well too. And I think once you're able to actually find that medium, it would allow for you to actually feel much more freer to express your masculinity and to embrace it, right? Because what we're saying, what we're not saying, and what we're saying at the same time is that even though there are really, quote unquote, toxic traits and bad traits about being masculine and men, those, you also have to be a part of those traits as well and acknowledge those traits and be able to actually learn to live with those things, right? Because you can't throw it away. It will be always inhibited with us because of the privileges that we have as men in this society, right?
I agree. That's, you know, that's our story. That's our life. I think we just need to learn from them, you know, and continue the conversation outside of that kitchen conversation to with our circles, with our friends, because we probably have the privilege of, you know, providing a space where other men and masculine folks can have these type of conversations. But what about those other men that are out there that they really want to make a difference, but they don't have access, you know, maybe because they don't have internet, or maybe they don't have, you know, organizations around them. So I think that's why, you know, through books, you know, it's something that you can bring to different places. You don't need electricity, you don't need technology, you just need to open it, and it's, you know, thousands of stories there that you can read and you can get inspired and learn. So after saying that, you know, what Steve, what would you suggest to maybe young folks or adults that they really want to get into this world of writing poems or writing? Any tips, any favorite poets that you follow and inspire you to be who you are right now? Can you give us a little bit of that story, you know?
Yeah. I read a lot of poetry, and I have a pretty extensive collection at home. And there are many poets writing about masculinity and just writing about being a person. One good one is Jericho Brown. Dinesh Smith, I think, is from Twin Cities. I think he's excellent. Um, Bob Hickok is one of my favorite poets. He writes about being a man in a way that he explores and expresses his gentleness and his kind of quietness, you know, and that's really. I didn't know that a poet or a man could do that until I started seeing it in some other people's poems. So those are three. I mean, there are many, many. Robert Bly was one who was also known in Minnesota, who had a whole men's movement thing going on in the '70s, and he was big in poetry for a while. There's just, if you start looking on, let's say, poets.org, which is the Academy of American Poets website, or if you just start kind of finding contemporary, even online literary magazines, you can find a lot of stuff, and you just kind of go from there. But if a listener wanted to start with a place to find poets who are writing about their experiences, I would maybe start at poets.org. Yeah.
And I can't remember exactly, Steve, but at that workshop, I know I probably did express some like trepidation and some, you know, feeling a little anxious about like, how do I even do this?
Yeah.
You know, I think in my brain when I came into that workshop, it was like, there's a right way to write poetry. And for someone who knows little to nothing about poetry other than back like way 1,000 years ago in high school English, you know, like I just was like, I don't know if I'm going to be able to do this the right way. And I'm wondering if you could speak about that. Is there a right way? Is there, you know, do you just sit down with a piece of paper and a pen and see what flows? Or is there like a structure or, you know,
Well, I
it's
think
probably different.
nobody really knows how to write poetry until they start doing it, and I think you just kind of sit down and see what comes out a lot. Um, it's all poetry is art made of language. That's what it is. So you're using language as your medium, and you're manipulating. Not you're expressing whatever in language, or telling a story, or whatever it might be. And there's just a billion different ways to do that. So a lot of the ways people think they're not supposed to write poetry are ways you can write poetry. I've seen a lot of different approaches, and one of the best things you can do to learn about what different kinds of forms and modes people are using is just to read widely in the field. But yeah, I mean, I try to get kid when I like, let's say when I teach a creative writing class, I just try to get kids putting things on paper and then respond encouragingly to it. That's how we start, you know. Um, and I think you can tell also somebody who is going to take off with poetry, likes poetry, or just something clicks and they start doing it. regularly, usually a young poet or even a older poet who's just never turned to it before, they'll really feel like they didn't know this was here, that it was a new thing. And a young poet will typically feel like they're doing all this stuff that's like revolutionary and on fire and just amazing, and nobody's done this before. And which is not, it's, you know, it's kind of grandiose, but it's good to have that feeling as a beginning poet that you're doing stuff that you never thought, you're putting things on paper that you never thought you could talk about, or just that you never thought you could talk about them in this way. That's a healthy experience. It's a healthy enthusiasm to have as a beginning poet.
Yeah, I was going to say, for me, I think a lot of what I've learned in the last several years about my own personal growth as a man and as a masculine person has really been a lot about like feeling my own discomfort and like continuing down that path, even though it feels really uncomfortable. And so, yeah, just, you know, what you shared there about like how a person can be encouraging of, you know, someone's poetry or whatever they're writing down or creating, right? It doesn't have to just be poetry. It can be music. It can be art. But just to have like those people around you who see it and recognize it and like want to encourage those healthy practices, you know, it feels really good. And it was a very surprising thing for me. And now I'm like, dang, I want to sit down and write some more poems. It's been a couple months. But yeah, I mean, I think because I was able to practice that, leaning into my discomfort in that workshop, it really like these beautiful things grew out of that. And, you know, now we're here having this cool conversation. And so just a plug to like, when folks are feeling that discomfort, it doesn't mean we have to like run from it. We can actually lean more deeply into those things. And I think a lot of beauty, a lot of things come out of that.
Yeah, and sometimes those experiences that are hard to think about or whatever, once you write about them, like Pheng was kind of saying, they don't have the same power over you, and you can kind of release and let go. If it's something that's hard to talk about or write about, you can kind of put it on paper and see it for what it is, and it isn't this huge, you know, terrible memory after you put it down on paper and realize, well, I had a pretty normal reaction there. It was normal to be afraid, or it was normal to cry, or it was normal to feel ashamed, or whatever. And the writing is one way to release yourself from the hold that some of those old memories or experiences can have on you.
Yeah, I think it allows you to put it somewhere. To your point earlier in your reading, is it allows you to not hold it anymore. Otherwise, you're just going to be holding it within yourself for the rest of your life, and that becomes so detrimental for some of us, because even though that holding it might be so minor in terms of its weight, but the more you hold it and the more you think about it, the heavier it gets and the more overwhelming it becomes and the more saturated you become in it, right? And so if you are able to actually like sort of purge it out, quote unquote, out of yourself and place it somewhere else externally, not to other people, obviously, but somewhere where you know it's being held not within, so it doesn't actually drain you and your energy. And so I think it is, to Sean's point, very healing and very nurturing the way that you're talking about it and the way that you've been sharing it with us, Steve. And so I would really hope that encourage folks to really think about that as a venue and a space to really go into as well too. I wonder, sort of my last question here, I know we're getting short on time here, is like, what has been the reception amongst men and masculine folks in the community to your writings? Steve, if you have any of that to share with us.
Well, I was telling Sean before the program that I haven't had as much opportunity to read this material out at readings and that sort of thing. So I don't necessarily have a huge gauge of how people have responded to American Male. It's also not been reviewed, where usually I have a book out and one or two or three people will review it somewhere online, and it's not been reviewed, so I haven't had anybody's kind of detailed feedback on it. But I mean, there hasn't been any negative blowback or anything. There's actually the problem. The problem is there hasn't been a lot of feedback at all. I sell a lot of books to friends in the poetry community and just friends in general who live here in the area, and they respond positively to it. But I don't. It's weird because I don't feel it's almost like it's not really a public thing because it's not getting that much attention. It's just a book of poetry. So it's not real prominent in the community around here. People know I'm like the local poet, and they know I teach at the high school. And sometimes I hold readings or invite people in to do readings here, and those are usually decently attended. So that's about the extent of feedback or response in the community to what I'm doing with poems locally. Anyway, I tend to go out into other areas. I've got a reading on August 6th in Cleveland. I'm going to go to Rochester, Indiana at the end of August. I'm going to do a thing online with the library in Normal, Illinois in September. So I kind of try to get it out there in the larger American or Midwestern community as much as I can.
And what's next for Steve Henn? Now that you released this book, what's your future plans? Obviously, you sound like you're busy. That's good, but what's next?
Yeah, I've got 7 or 8 reading or signing events lined up from between here and the end of November. So that's good. All that is going on, and that will allow me to get American Mail and my previous book, Guilty Prayer, out there more. So that's part of what's next. I'm also waiting to hear back from a kind of a dream press that is reviewing a couple of full-length manuscripts of mine, and I'm hopeful. I'm a little bit afraid to be too hopeful, but if I get either one of those manuscripts accepted by this particular institution, I'll really feel like I made it in the poetry world finally, and I've been working at this for a long time. So I'm hoping that works out. And if it doesn't, then I got to find a different place to maybe publish those books. So I've got a lot of stuff that's in the can, as they say in film, that I can get out there. It's just a matter of waiting to find the right place to get it out there.
Well, I know like Pheng said, we're getting close to our time here. So I just wanted to share my gratitude with you again, Steve, for joining us. And thank you again for that workshop and that, the way that you showed up and sort of led that and made me feel really comfortable as someone who was, nervous to be in that space. And I think that the potential of the workshops as well as these future readings and things that you're doing, it feels really exciting to me because I think there are a lot of men and masculine folks out there who, maybe haven't connected with people who are like you, Steve, who are sharing about these more healthy masculinity habits that we can be building. And so it feels good and exciting and healing for me, at least, and I hope for others as well. So thanks again for that experience and for coming on here today.
Sure. Thank you to all you guys. This has been a good conversation.
Yeah. Any other last things that we haven't asked you, Steve, that you want to share before I close us out here?
Maybe if anybody's interested in looking at more of my work, you can find access to books and stuff at therealstevehenn.com. Okay. And you can also find videos there. I have a YouTube channel, and there's a number of videos of old readings and so on that are under the video link there on the page. So find the books, you can find the videos, you can find individual poems, and so on and so forth.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Steve, for joining us and coming and sharing your work with us and sharing your journey around masculinity and manhood with us as well. We always appreciate it when men from the community come and join us and the ways in which they're doing their work or they're thinking about their identity. I know we will drop the link to your websites and your YouTube on our pages so that people can check it out, and your book definitely as well too, and appreciate you sharing a snippet of the book with us. As always, we appreciate everybody that joins us in the conversation live at this moment. I'm appreciating all the comments that came through. Whether we were able to incorporate the comments into the conversation or not, we definitely were paying attention to it and we're thinking about it. And so we always appreciate folks. And even if you're viewing us afterwards, definitely keep commenting, keep the conversation going, as we always say at the kitchen table. It doesn't end here only. And we hope that you always take these conversations and explore it more in your own neighborhoods and your own groups of friends and your own congregations and community as well, too. So we will be back in 2 weeks, and it will be August. Summer will almost be done, and fall will be approaching us soon. So we have a number of things that we probably will be looking forward to. But definitely let us know the kinds of conversation we should talk about as well too. Otherwise, we will be talking about current events. And as always, we appreciate our philanthropy partners, Blue Cross Blue Shield and the Noble Foundation, for supporting us and allowing us to make these things actually happen. And we will see you all in 2 weeks at noon right here at the kitchen table. Take care.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Steve.
Thanks, everybody.
Yes.